everyone has presented so far. So now we can move into we have about 23 minutes for Q&A. Please type your questions in the chat. I have a couple, but I see a question here from Baha that I believe is for you, Shane. They ask, in the shared equity rental model, what percentage of payment goes towards equity, and can the tenants eventually own the apartment?
So I don't have great answers for, well, I have a clear answer for the second one. It's no. I think the right answer to that is no. I think the idea is that this is a public resource that people can, share in the appreciation and value, but not something that we want to, invest in, and then it just becomes a fully privatized asset again in the future. That's my view. Others could take a different view, certainly. On the share that accrues to tenants, it really does depend a lot on many things. I think in higher cost markets, I think the share would be smaller because of like cap rates and kind of stuff beyond my knowledge on the development and financing side. But, let's say that I think one thing to acknowledge is that even with a fee simple, detached house mortgage, if you've got like a 4% interest loan on a $500,000 home, you're probably, trying to remember when I bought my house, you're getting like a third of what you're paying is actually going toward equity. So even then, it's not actually a huge amount. And it would certainly be less than that, because as a renter, you didn't put money up front. So there's less kind of skin in the game on that side. There's also just kind of property management and operations that you don't have with detached housing. So it would be smaller for sure. And you're just building up a stake in the appreciation rather than just capturing it all up front. But, even if it's just a few $100s a month, that's a big difference compared to absolutely nothing at all, which is what you get right now.
Excellent. I want to throw in a question, probably for Nia. How are you seeing inflation, rising interest rates impacting the communities you're serving and their attempts to build wealth? And then subsequent to that, what are some other barriers that you see to really scaling up your impact and your reach?
Thank you, Andy. So definitely, I think when it comes to the fund, when you look at the return targets and you look at that and you look at inflation, that wipes that out. At the same time, definitely most of our investors, I won't say all, but I'll say most of our investors, and that even includes the investors that we've targeted with the Coogee Chakalia pool, have recognized from the beginning, we're not looking at something that they're going to get rich from in any case. So the returns that most of our investors are seeking are, I would say, really social returns. And of course, if there are financial returns, I would say the financial returns are icing. We ask our investors, why they are investing in the fund. And a lot of the responses that we get in terms of why they're investing in the fund is really supporting different processes. So I think, for example, what Shane is speaking to, I appreciate kind of this notion of home voters. And this kind of notion of just how kind of priorities shift, for example, depending on where we are financially. So I think really kind of enabling people to think about different types of ways for us to transact financially, I think makes a huge difference. It's definitely, something we have to think about when it comes to our small businesses. So we try to be mindful of how inflation is impacting them when we're thinking about how we want to support them. That definitely, I think, makes on the kind of product side, on the loan side, it does make Ujima a little more competitive. So we have heard, for example, that small businesses are still having trouble accessing traditional capital. And we now know that those rates are starting to go up. What was the second question, Andy? I can't remember now.
Just some other barriers you see to scale and impact.
Yeah, Well, I think I would say the primary, so really quickly, we see kind of scale in a couple of ways. So, and there's a couple of ways that we've talked about scale. So one is within Ujima internally. So what we've said is if we're able to demonstrate success with this $5 million fund, then our next fund is a $25 million fund. So $5 million is small for our sector, but kind of big enough, I think, to demonstrate some viability. And we've actually already started to think about the next fund. So we've actually started to think about what we think this $25 million fund looks like. So for example, we think it's going to be primarily an equity fund. And we think it's going to primarily focus on real estate because there are, as with this conversation, just lots of really, I think, kind of exciting, innovative conversations happening when it comes to thinking about real estate and land. And so that's one way we're thinking about scale. And I don't think there are necessarily any barriers to that. We've done a lot of learning, for example, with this fund, and then we have peers that we can learn from that we can apply to the next fund. The other way we've started to think about scale, and I'd be interested to hear what Brett thinks about this, because Brett kind of mentioned the standardization issue. But the other way we think about scale is to see ecosystem approaches in other places. And so then that's outside of Ujima, that's horizontal. And for us, the more communities that we see, building community wealth, building ecosystems, we consider that a success, and we recognize it isn't going to look the same in every community. So we're very careful to communicate that the ecosystem is going to be customized to what the locality is. But that's another way that we see scale. And in that instance, I would say the barriers, I think, are the usual. Each community kind of has its own learning curve. There are ways that we're working to help with that with our translocal membership. And not just each community having its own learning curve in terms of practitioners, but then in terms of kind of the wider community itself, and learning that these initiatives exist, and that we're starting to show viability, and that they are alternatives that they could think about participating in.
Let's see, there's a question in the chat that I'll direct to you, Brett. I'm trying to make sure I understand the question here. So it says, I'm curious if you can speak to the community density or critical mass you think is necessary in a given investment project or sets of projects. I'm trying to get a sense of what you've seen work at specific scales, so rural versus exurban versus urban.
It's a good question. Saying the question a little bit differently, but I think the same spirit. How many investors do you need? How many do you want? How do you identify them? And there are not easy or right answers there. I would say often we're not talking about thousands of investors. We're talking about maybe hundreds, maybe less, depending on the model. So I think this could work in a rural context, a less dense context. The question is how you identify people. Could you go through existing institutional networks, through churches or through immigrant groups or through other, local, local chambers of commerce or resident associations, neighborhood groups? Certainly some of the models have done door knocking, have done flyering, have done tables at community fairs or parades or what have you. So all of those are possible. It's just breaking through the noise, right? People are busy, they have a lot going on. Who understands what an equity investment is, right? Like, who trusts somebody asking for your money? There's a lot there to overcome. And so that's how these models, to the extent they can work through word of mouth, great. And sometimes if they're purely market driven, it's a little less clear what's truly the financial benefit for people. So we need to be straightforward about that. On the other hand, if they're got a lot of philanthropy in them, it almost actually is like too good to be true. Like, what are you trying to pull over, right? So there's just a lot of education and need to orient and enter in and help with design and so forth. And the last thing I'd add that I've seen in some of the models, but not others, there are tensions between being too closed a network, right? And kind of if you're, you know, you're not trying to like a lot of these are intentionally trying to counteract disequities, but it can be easy to become a pure referential thing. And so there are tensions between using the peer networks, which you kind of want to do, but which peer networks are you in fact using? So I'll leave it at that.
Nia, you just you had a note in the chat. Do you want to speak to that?
Oh, sure. I mean, just for the sake of time, I just figured I'd just drop it in the chat. But yeah, we have, so we, for the fund, we have around 350 investors. For our membership, we have around 800 members, 400 of which, about half which are voting members. So we have to kind of engage those voting members pretty regularly to be able to conduct our investments. The only other thing I'll say is we had a couple of students at Harvard Kennedy School document and kind of assess one of our votes. And I can't remember the reference. I'll have to kind of go back. I'll have to go back and find it and ask them for it. But there was a reference point that was based on kind of participatory governance literature that had a 1,000 as a number in terms of when you're thinking about, I guess, participatory communities. And then it seemed like the reference point was beyond that 1,000, then it starts to kind of get unwieldy.
And I'll note, as a nonprofit lender, the money we lend out, we borrow because we're not a depository institution, and we have about 150 debt investors. Everything from banks to faith-based investors to individuals. And my experience is that the challenge is not finding the capital, but the time cost of getting it, because it's a disaggregated market. Like if I'm trying to raise money from VCs, there's a whole ecosystem. But here it's just very piecemeal, and you have to tell the story of the financial return, the social return, and it's not always apples to apples. So that's just a challenge. Let's see, there was a question for you, Shane, in the chat. It said, it was from Perry, and she said, similar to your discussion about the 30-year mortgage as a federal policy, what other policy changes do you think lend themselves better to federal public policy as opposed to state level policy shifts?
If this is a question about like the movement building and so forth needed to change federal policy, I am probably not the person. I've never even been to DC, so I just don't know. But I mean, I do think it is important to just acknowledge what the federal government can do and what that states and local governments can't. And I think especially when it comes to acquisition of real estate, everyone else has to have a balanced budget. And so, the amount that you can acquire is sort of dependent on how much capital you can raise for that equity component of the acquisition. And that's going to be severely limiting in how quickly you can scale up anything like this. Whereas with the federal government support, you can either get the equity or, as I'm talking about with these long-term financing or low interest financing options, I know this will kind of raise hackles for some finance people, but I think, in this kind of model, it would be possible to acquire a building entirely on debt. And I think that actually does become feasible when you're not trying to maximize the investment and you're not trying to raise the rents as much as possible and get as much appreciation as you possibly can. The risks of the price falling, which is why we have equity contributions in most acquisitions of real estate, it just doesn't have the same importance. But I don't know, Brett is in DC, he might have more thoughts on this.
My only thought is everybody wants, every level of government wants the other level of governments to do it. So you talk to the feds and they're like, states would be great at this, or the cities. And you talk to the cities and they're like, we need federal support. So
I mean, I will just quickly say that I don't think this is going to start in the federal government. I do think it's something that's going to have to start locally with, state funds, local funds, philanthropic funds, community generated funds. And it's going to have to be proven out at that level before I think the federal government ever jumps in and really backs something like this. They're going to need to see it tried and succeed to some extent first.
Well, something I think a lot about, and I would love all of you guys' thoughts on this, is when it comes to community wealth building or affordable housing or climate, I always think about what is the role of public policy at whatever level, local, state, or federal, versus the private markets, whether that's market rate or concessionary or philanthropy. How do you guys think about as it pertains to community wealth building, like the allocation of time that we should put into each of those areas and how they work together or don't?
I mean, I guess I don't know if I would jump in with kind of strict allocation of time. But I would say we should definitely be allocating some time to public policy. So if we're not, we should be paying attention to it. I'm also going to add in something that I just want to talk about that I think is related, but I just want to also just talk about it. You didn't ask about it. But what's really kind of interesting and compelling to me, and this is related about Shane's presentation, because even thinking about public policy is cultural organizing. So when I think about just the information that Shane has offered in his presentation, just makes me think about, both community organizing and cultural organizing, and just excavating more of the history of how we got here. And so we're starting to see that. So now redlining, for example, is more of a common story that people can easily access. But just even this tidbit about how it is that we came to be such a home ownership society. And it could feel just kind of normal, and it could feel, or it's normal. Well, I should say it could feel just completely completely natural. And it isn't. It is a created and very intentionally created reality. So, for example, just kind of doing more to excavate those histories about how we came to have the mortgage tax deduction, why it was decided that home ownership was important. And then how we've then followed up to kind of reinforce that, to reinforce the importance of home ownership, so we can also subscribe to it. So it does just make me think about, for sure, we should be allocating time to public policy, but not just us practitioners. We should, I think, also be allocating time to cultural organizing that has our wider communities understanding the role of public policy as well.
Go ahead, Brett.
I'll just quickly make the plug that I think we have collectively underinvested, because maybe we like doing the good work of doing the work, and I totally understand that. But that leaves us really strong and doers, and I think our muscles collectively, not just in this space, but even more broadly, are too weak and too poorly organized. And when you think of kind of whether it's associations of realtors or home builders or have you, like, these are very organized and motivated groups that have a lot of influence, and we don't see that in the social sector and the community sector as much. And so I think we do have to invest more. It needs to be every institution. It needs to be senior leaders, and it needs to be at all levels of government. And there are strategies that emerge that it needs to be relational, not just when we have a specific ask, but really over a long relationship. So I'll stop there.
On the sort of market versus non-market side, a lot of my work, my book included, is really about sort of tying together these different interests, kind of what the market can do, what the role of supply is, but also the need for protections and like dignity in housing, and also the need to invest public funds because, private is not going to get us all the way there for a lot of people. But I think, people tend to fall into one or the other of those camps rather than sort of recognizing all the linkages. And, for me, I guess one way I've been putting this lately is like, we should have the market provide for everyone that it possibly can. And then we should invest as much public resources as society will allow us to. Like, both of these things should happen, and both are entirely complementary. And we shouldn't treat them as competition with each other. There are realities like the fact that if we zone in such a way where all of the capacity for new housing is in communities of color or low-income communities, or just multifamily housing communities generally. So you have to tear down rentals in order to build higher density ones. Those are choices we are making now that we don't have to make, that sort of make it appear as though market provision of housing and non-market provision of housing are in competition or in tension with each other. But that's a choice we can choose to make differently in the future, and should.
We have a few minutes left. There's a comment from Joshua in the chat. He said, in suburban communities, we need more multifamily and apartment dwelling units to increase housing diversity. Ultimately, it's a problem of being more progressive with suburban zoning and ensuring the developers help pay the cost of infrastructure connections, i.e. water, sewer, and gas. I don't know if there are any reflections on that or any other last questions or comments that folks want to make.
Well, I have a last comment. I
Please.
guess these would just be my last thoughts. So, yeah, again, just thinking about Shane's presentation, just really appreciating, and there's a way in which our co-founder Aaron Tanaka has kind of used the same phrase, and we've heard it from Clinton, although it was different when he said it. But this notion of kind of a third way. And I think that is a really powerful part of this conversation. So Shane, when you talk about a third way, or when you talk about the importance of not seeing, market versus non-market in competition, I think this is a really important part of this conversation. This is a big conversation in Boston right now. So when we talk about community land trust and people, there's this tension between individual wealth and community wealth, and there doesn't have to be. And so I think there's also just just some cultural work that I think that we can do around how we have these conversations, where we don't present one kind of solution as the only solution, the end all, the be all, and where we don't have kind of flat representations of communities, but understanding when we talk about diversity, our communities really are diverse. And so we're going to have some solutions that work for some parts of communities that don't work for other parts of communities, and vice versa. So hopefully our conversations are just kind of a little more nuanced and not so crude. So I just think that that's really important.
I can build on that with my final comment here, which is just, I think you see it in types of home ownership or community ownership. You see it in just types of housing generally, that there are a lot of people who essentially feel, or they will say outright, I wouldn't live like that, I wouldn't want that, and therefore it shouldn't exist. And I think that's something we need to move beyond. The most common example I see of that is micro units. I'm in my 30s, it's not for me, and therefore it shouldn't exist at all, without recognizing that these things all serve different people at different points in their lives, who have different preferences, different needs. And it really should be this, idea of let's give people as many options as they want. And we're always going to have to really think carefully about, are there serious, are there harms that come from that? Or is it just people choosing different choices? And those are different things. And so I think, with all of these options, including the four that Brett outlined, and my shared equity, which I think falls somewhere outside of those or is a hybrid of some of those, it really is about how do we try to, give people as many options as they can for how to live and how to own, and how to kind of have the security they want in their own community.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. I know we're at time. I want to give Jen a sec to plug the next panel, but thanks again, everyone, for joining. And Jen, go ahead.
Hi, friends. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Brett, Nia, Shane, Andy. So first, ups to you. And if anyone else in the chat wants to add to that, that would be fantastic. So the final panel of the day is happening at 3:30. Lisa Bender, who is a city council person from Minneapolis, Minnesota, is going to be speaking with the former mayor of Central Falls, who is running for treasurer of Rhode Island, James Diosa, and a former city council person from Cambridge, Jivan Cibrano Wheeler. I apologize if I didn't get his last name totally right. And so they're going to be talking about a couple things, but including, how do you create community buy-in for some of these types of particularly ordinance level changes that need to happen to change how we build housing and how we build wealth within our cities. So a really cool thing that just came out is a report from Streets.mn, Streets Minnesota, that some of the changes that were built into the Minneapolis 2040 plan in terms of housing have yielded changes in the local housing market, which have made rents come down as opposed to what's going on in the rest of the US on average. So plug for that panel, just stay in this lane, stay in this link, and you'll see it at 3:30. And I appreciate all of your time. And this was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andy.
My pleasure.